Thanks all for coming. This is quite an impressive turnout. Secretary Moniz is a draw, to be sure, and we appreciate all of your coming on a late summer day. It's an honor to be here to welcome the Honorable Ernest Moniz, Secretary of Energy, to the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. My name is Jason Bordoff. Just by way of introduction, I'm the director of the Center on Global Energy Policy, a position I took in January after leaving the White House to help start a new energy policy research center here at Columbia to help the public and policymakers understand how the energy world is changing and what the implications are. I can't imagine a more interesting or important time to undertake this effort. We're in the midst of transformational changes, as you all know, in the energy landscape right now that are having profound economic, geopolitical, environmental implications. And the energy policy decisions we make as a country in the next several years are going to be critical in determining whether we can realize the opportunities and address the challenges that are associated with these changes. And informing those policy decisions is what the new Center on Global Energy Policy here at Columbia is all about. Through objective, rigorous analysis informed by real-world experience and market insights to help policymakers navigate the increasingly complex world of energy. Drawing on the resources of New York City, the global center for energy finance, markets, much of industry, Columbia's world-class faculty across a range of disciplines from law to business to international relations to science and engineering. Columbia's global centers in many key energy locations around the world like Brazil, China, the Middle East. In fact, I'll be in Istanbul next week at the Columbia Global Center there, hosting a roundtable on the regional energy outlook there. And we're already off to a fast start, having hosted dozens of senior energy officials from U.S. and foreign governments, leading figures from industry, from NGOs. This past spring, we launched the center with events in London and in New York. The event here on campus in New York, I know many of you were at, was really a who's who in the energy world of Mayor Bloomberg, National Security Advisor Tom Donilon, Dan Yergin. In fact, we've only been around 6 months, but Ernie Moniz is not the first energy secretary we had because that event was timed just right so that Dan Poneman was the acting energy secretary at the time. And we have a first-rate lineup of speakers on tap for the fall. You'll find a list of those inside the brochures that are on each of your chairs. We want to move. We only have an hour, so we want to move very quickly to Secretary Moniz. I'm not introducing him, but let me just say in 15 seconds, I have known Secretary Moniz for many years. I can't imagine someone more ideally suited to this job. He's a brilliant scientist, academic, has been in government before, understands how government works, is true all of the above energy expert, fossil fuels, renewables, nuclear efficiency, and I'm very grateful that he is now serving in government as our energy secretary at this important time, and he cares passionately about making urgent progress on the challenge of climate change, which I know we're going to hear about today from him. 2 housekeeping notes. Please silence your cell phones. If you have questions for the secretary, there are cards on your chairs. Please write them on the cards and hand those cards to the people who will be walking through the aisle, and I'll take them, and we'll have time for some Q&A after his remarks. Finally, I just want to say a word of thanks to the people who put this event together on relatively short notice across the Columbia campus, but particularly Jesse McCormick, who manages the center on a day-to-day basis and whose leadership has really been invaluable to our success. David Sandalo will introduce the Secretary of Energy. Until June, David had spent the last 4 years at the Energy Department as the Assistant Secretary for Policy and International Affairs, and also as the acting Undersecretary of Energy. We were colleagues at Brookings. We were colleagues again in the administration, and I'm absolutely thrilled that we are colleagues again here at Columbia. When David left the Energy Department, we were able to persuade him to come to Columbia and to be the inaugural fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy. So please join me in welcoming David to introduce the Secretary.
Well, thanks, Jason. It's a great honor to be part of this exciting new center. And it's also a great honor to introduce one of my heroes, U.S. Energy Secretary Ernest J. Moniz. Dr. Moniz is not only the U.S. Energy Secretary, he also may be the single best qualified person in the world for that position. If there were an accuracy in labeling law for federal agencies, the U.S. Department of Energy would be called the Department of Energy, Science, and Nuclear Weapons. As many people here know, the Department of Energy's energy budget is a bit smaller than its science budget, depending on how you count. And the budget for managing the nuclear stockpile is even bigger than that. There aren't many people in the world who have genuine expertise in all three of these areas, in energy, science, and the nuclear stockpile, but Dr. Moniz would certainly top any such list. Prior to his appointment, Dr. Moniz was the Cecil and Ida Green Professor of Physics and Engineering Systems at MIT, where he was a faculty member since 1973. At MIT, he headed the Department of Physics and the Bates Linear Accelerator. He was the founding director of the MIT Energy Initiative and the MIT Laboratory for Energy and the Environment. From 1997 until January 2001, Dr. Moniz served as Undersecretary at the Department of Energy, the third-ranking position in the department that he now runs. And last May, the U.S. Senate voted to confirm Dr. Moniz as Energy Secretary with a 97-0 vote, an extraordinary tribute from a body that's deeply divided on many issues. It's a great honor for me to introduce Dr. Ernest J. Moniz.
Well, thank you, David. And also thanks again to your 4 years of service in the department. And I'm pleased that we had at least some overlap at the end. But David, among other, I'll say a few other things. David spearheaded the Clean Energy Ministerial, which is a fairly recent institution of energy ministers of a lot of the major emitting countries, among other characteristics. In that, an associated activity was working with MIT, helped advance a Women in Clean Energy initiative, which was really important. He guided Development Administration's Clean Energy Standard proposal, and I think really focused a lot in helping lay the groundwork for electric vehicles at the department. So I think David had a pretty strong fingerprints on the department and what we will still try to accomplish in this second term. Also, I want to thank Jason putting this together while he was allegedly on vacation, but we all know how that goes. Again, as Jason said, we've known each other for several years while Jason was in the White House and I was in academia, with the roles apparently now reversed, but we can still carry on our discussion. And certainly, we really welcome the establishment of this Center for Global Energy Policy. The last 6+ years at MIT, I was really engaged primarily in building up an MIT energy initiative that similarly tried to bring people into the energy discussion from many perspectives, technology and policy. And I think that such centers really play a very important role for having the kinds of open and analytical discussions, I think, that can inform policy making. So I'm looking forward certainly to getting input from Columbia and from other centers of this type. So today I'm going to say a few words, starting out with an area in which kind of this region, this institution, and maybe all of you can help provide some leadership. Unfortunately, a leadership opportunity that partly has its genesis in the tragedy of Hurricane Sandy, and we'll come back to some of the specifics there. We obviously saw the devastation of many of the region's critical infrastructures, energy infrastructures. The effects on the energy infrastructures were amplified by the interdependencies of those infrastructures, such as electricity goes out, it turns out getting fuels was kind of tough. And frankly, that's an example of something that was not fully appreciated until the experience occurred. So in that event, which it's hard to remember, it was less than a year ago. It seems a long time. What are you trying to tell me? Okay, great. Okay, the president certainly started a strong response with a kind of a no red tape edict that put the full force of the federal government behind the region's response. Critical was strong collaboration with the states, the governors, and other leaders. He put together a multi-agency task force working together under the leadership of the HUD Secretary, Sean Donovan. And I think since that time, the administration has maintained its strong commitment to response. And what I want to come back to in the end is that that response certainly has a strong focus in terms of helping individuals, citizens rebuild their homes, their lives, et cetera. But something that we'll again come back to, a very important component, is that we have to help this rebuilding in a smart way, in a way that prepares the energy infrastructures, not for the last storm, but for the next storm, for the next possible major disruptions. And I think that's where there's a real chance for leadership here in the Northeast Corridor as one starts that rebuilding from Sandy's impacts. Of course, these events, this extreme weather events, obviously aren't unique to this part of the country. Whether it's hurricanes in the Gulf and the Southeast, derecho that knocked out power for 5 million people, Mid-Atlantic, are just recent cases in point. And in fact, in the last 10 years, we've been hit by 9 of the 10 most expensive hurricanes in our history, costing well north of $300 billion. So this idea of responding to increase resilience, I think, is critical, since these recent events, unfortunately, are likely harbingers of things to come, scenes that will likely be repeated as carbon emissions from human activity threaten to alter the global climate, consistent with the long-standing expectations of the climate science community. Clearly, we understand that we cannot label a specific event to warming, but statistically, we also know that the pattern is unmistakably along the lines of those anticipated for quite some time. So today, I'm going to talk about the President's Climate Action Plan, what we're doing to prepare for a changing climate, how we are working to try to mitigate its effects, and then after talking a little bit about that, I'll return to this issue of the infrastructure and the resilience that we need in building for a low-carbon future, but nevertheless a low-carbon future in which we have to expect we will be suffering some of the consequences of climate change. On my first day as Secretary, I was quoted as saying, and I must say the quote was accurate, I'm not here to debate what's not debatable. I mean, the evidence is overwhelming. The science is clear, certainly clear for the level that one needs for policymaking in terms of the real and urgent threat of climate change. I think the science community is inherently conservative in its statements about near consensus positions, and it's instinctively open to questioning grounded in data and analysis, and that's of course appropriate. But still, the overwhelming conclusion, certainly for the policy world, is that prudence demands strong common sense near-term policy actions to minimize the risks of global warming, and that's what the President's Climate Action Plan does in the absence of legislative remedies. Last week, as we know, the draft findings of the most recent analysis by the UN's IPCC, whether it was officially released or not, talked about, again, major issues coming up, including issues like 3 feet of sea level rise in this century and a 95% probability that human activity is a principal driver of these issues. So again, the empirical evidence is clearly continues to mount. Rising temperatures, fires, droughts, more intense storms posing serious threats to our communities, but also to our energy infrastructure, with a case in point being the recent California declaration of a state of emergency for San Francisco, as forest fires over 100 miles away threatened the power lines that provided power to that city. So as most of you know, 84% of carbon emissions are energy-related. Mother Nature seems to be returning the favor, exacting a climate-related toll on the health and reliability of our energy infrastructure. In July, DOE released a report detailing these impacts, and here is just a short list of the threats of climate to our energy infrastructure. Gulf of Mexico produces half of U.S. crude and natural gas, contains nearly half the total U.S. refining capacity. Rising sea levels, storm surges could cost these industries as much as $8 billion per year by 2030 in the projections. Power generation units are at risk of partial or full shutdowns, less water and higher temperatures. Last summer, Braidwood Nuclear Plant in Illinois had to get special permission from the NRC to continue operating after the temperature of the water in its cooling pond rose to 102 degrees. Unconventional oil and gas production, increasingly vulnerable to decreasing water availability at the same time that U.S. is relying more and more heavily on these energy sources. And renewable energy is not exempt. Hydropower, bioenergy, concentrating solar power all share similar vulnerabilities to water availability. Electric grid carries less current, operates less efficiently when temperatures are higher. Fuel transport by rail and barge, growing modes for moving unconventional energy, susceptible to interruption from storms and floods. And as we've seen here along the eastern seaboard and in the Gulf of Mexico, energy infrastructures located along the coasts at a risk from sea level rises, storm surges, and flooding. So, in an effort to both mitigate and adapt to these and other climate-related impacts, on June 25th, President Obama laid out a broad plan to cut carbon emissions, increase the production of clean energy, and double down on energy efficiency. Because the need to act is urgent, the President's Climate Action Plan utilizes the substantial authorities and resources of the executive branch, engaging all of its agencies in meeting this imperative. Again, the President expressed the continuing desire to work with Congress on legislative solutions, but in the meantime, we will focus on doing all that we can with current administrative authorities. I'm not going to go into detail in terms of all the specifics of the plan, but note that DOE does play a lead role in a number of the actions called for, and is a member of the interagency team and others. And let me talk about a few of these. One is the need to improve and enhance opportunities for energy efficiency, which to my way of thinking, is an absolutely essential element for any credible response to climate change, risk mitigation, to the kinds of lowering of carbon emissions that we will need, not just in this decade, but in the decades ahead. In fact, the first official event I attended after being confirmed as Energy Secretary, about 2 hours after I was sworn in, was an Alliance to Save Energy meeting. I did so to underscore my commitment to energy efficiency as a way to achieve two critical objectives: a critical avenue for near-term reductions in carbon emissions with compounded benefits over time, and a way to significantly reduce the energy bills of American consumers and businesses. This commitment included working with OMB to expedite agency review of a range of new appliance efficiency rules that were, in many cases, long overdue. This more activist dialogue between DOE and OMB has produced a final rule for standby efficiency of microwave ovens, and 2 weeks ago, proposed rule for metal halide lamp fixtures. The microwave oven rule was the first to employ the updated social cost of carbon analysis developed by an interagency task force, estimating kind of a central value of $36 per ton of CO2, well within the spectrum of other analyses, perhaps even on the low end. We have published a schedule to put out more rules, and I think this is kind of a new way of approaching between DOE and OMB, and we're on track. We said that we'd have 2 more rules issued this month, August, and we're pretty much on track for commercial walk-in coolers and freezers and for commercial refrigeration. We also committed to a very important proposed rule for electric motors this November, and we intend to finalize all 4 of these rules by May of 2014, even as we continue to work through a now defined schedule for many, many more efficiency rules. Now, the efficiency savings from any individual rule, may sound small given the magnitude of the climate problem. Typically, it may be a few billion dollars in tens of megatons of carbon dioxide over 30 years. But the cumulative impact is considerable, which is exactly why we need to stay on this course of putting through these technology-grounded efficiency rules for a whole range of appliances and the like. In fact, on an analogous point, I would raise a 2001 report from the National Academy of Sciences that examined DOE's fossil and energy efficiency portfolios in their first 20 years. And it concluded that the 22 programs they analyzed, which cost about $13 billion total between 1978 and 2001, yielded economic benefits of about $40 billion, so a substantial return on investment. But I think an interesting part of the story is the study attributed 3/4 of the benefits, $30 billion, to 3 efficiency programs that cost $11 million. So even relatively small efficiency programs can in fact yield huge results, both in economic benefits and reductions in carbon emissions. So again, we are going to be very, very strongly focused on advancing this energy efficiency agenda in multiple domains, and certainly with our responsibility for rulemaking, I will assure you that we will maintain strong pressure in this direction. Another key provision of the President's climate plan directs EPA to issue rules for cutting carbon emissions from both new and existing power plants. Power sector, the single largest source of CO2 emissions in the United States, and as such, this action has been applauded by many as the most significant step the President can take to reduce carbon emissions absent legislative action. This directive has also been derided by some as an action that is tantamount to a, quote, war on coal. I think the former is certainly true, that it is the most significant step the President can take right now with executive action. But the charges of war on coal, I argue, demonstrate misunderstanding or misstatement of what is being called the all-of-the-above approach to U.S. energy policy. The reason is that in the view of the administration, the way we are approaching this is we must reduce CO2 emissions. The President has a near-term target of 17% reduction from 2005 by 2020, and we're about halfway there. But the idea is that all of the above means we will invest in the technology, research, development, and demonstration so that all of our energy sources can be enabled as marketplace competitors in a low-carbon energy world. That's what we mean by all of the above. It doesn't start by taking CO2 emissions off the table. It starts with CO2 reductions on the table and kind of a boundary condition, if you like, for going forward. But then, if you look at what are we doing about it in terms of the fossil and energy sources, so in the President's Climate Action Plan, there was a directive to issue a solicitation for up to $8 billion in loan guarantees for fossil energy projects that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There could be a whole bunch of them. I mean, going back to my technology days, one of my favorites, for example, something like chemical looping. This is a new technology for utilizing coal in a way that, if successful, will dramatically reduce carbon capture costs. That's just one example. We have advanced combined heat and power, very, very flexible, but saying, come forward with good ideas to stretch the technology in fossil-based with fossil-based sources, reducing CO2 emissions. Of course, the big one for coal in a low-carbon world has to be carbon capture and sequestration, possibly with utilization of the CO2. And once again, to be blunt, there was a lot of talking the talk for many, many years, because the reality is to demonstrate at large scale, which will be needed for large-scale sequestration and deep saline aquifers, for example. These are not inexpensive projects. They are big projects. So this administration is walking the talk. $6 billion in this administration put on the table for demonstrating these technologies at scale. So this is what we mean. We're committed to the low-carbon world, but we advance the technology development for all of our sources to be competitive. Obviously, renewables, which by definition is low carbon, nuclear power as well. I could discuss those later on, but I just wanted to take head on this issue that this is not a war on coal. Quite the contrary, it is preparing the way for coal to have potentially a place in the low carbon world that we believe is essential as we go forward. Now, I'll take another one on that's been very popular, loan guarantee program. And this tends to reflexively encourage use of the word Solyndra. And obviously no one likes a project to fail and to come on the taxpayer's tab. But since becoming secretary 3 months ago, I've had the opportunity to do an extensive review of the loan program. And what I have found is that this program, first, is supporting a large and diverse $34.4 billion portfolio of more than 30 projects, including one of the world's largest wind farms, several of the world's largest solar generation and thermal energy storage systems, first new commercial nuclear power plant in 3 decades, and more than a dozen new or retooled auto manufacturing plants across the country. And I might mention here, being in New York, that there are strong New York roots for this program. Richard Kaufman played a key role in advising on this loan program, and our relatively new director, Peter Davidson, is also coming from New York. Let me give an example of the program working the way it's supposed to. Utility-scale photovoltaic projects. 2009, 100-megawatt solar photovoltaic plants in this country were non-existent. And commercial financing, particularly debt financing, was simply unavailable. So using Recovery Act funds, the department's loan program office financed the first 6 utility-scale PV projects in the United States. Since those investments were made, 10 new utility-scale projects have been funded by the private investor community, precisely the outcome the president envisioned for this program. So I think, it just had to get a kickstart, and it's going. Another great example, Tesla Motors, you've probably been reading about. The loan to Tesla of nearly $500 million in June 2009 that was originated. It was viewed as very risky, and that was the low point of the American auto industry. It was the same month GM declared bankruptcy. It was the lowest number of jobs in the auto industry that we had had in a long, long time. And it was risky. But the portfolio was supposed to take some risks and push it ahead. Now, of course, as we all know, Tesla is certainly looking today like a great success. They repaid our loan 9 years earlier than due. They provided a prepayment premium for the taxpayer. They have been called by Consumer Reports the best car they've tested, not the best electric vehicle they've tested, the best car they've tested. It's a little bit pricey for some of the people in this room, but it's a business model that is introducing this new technology. You probably also saw that it was essentially rated the safest vehicle tested recently, and the architecture of it as an electric vehicle was part and parcel of its safety success. And then in 2014, 3,000 jobs right now in California, and in 2014, starting a export business. In fact, when I was in Paris about a month and a half ago, the American ambassador said that he understood that there were 25,000 orders in Paris alone for the Tesla for next year. So, I think this is what this program is about to do. But of course, not every investment is going to succeed. And frankly, I think you'd worry about the program if everyone did. But the track record is quite remarkable. The current and projected losses to the taxpayer on certain of the project investments, in our view, is very unlikely to exceed 10% of the loan loss reserve fund that Congress voted in. 2% of the overall portfolio and less than 10% of the loan loss reserve fund. I think most Wall Street performers might be pretty pleased with that performance. So another key part, and of course the Department of Energy has been very engaged, is driving down the cost of low-carbon solutions. And the department has been certainly at the forefront of the administration's attempts to stimulate the science and technology innovation required. In this administration, new approaches to innovation have been put in, to energy technology innovation have been put in place. ARPA-E, Energy Frontier Research Centers, innovation hubs. So we are also innovating in how we stimulate innovation, and I think that these are extremely promising programs. We've seen renewable energy generation from wind and solar double, and we've seen what's very important. The point I want to make is really critical reductions in the price of several clean energy technologies, and I'm going to take a moment just to look at those in a bit more detail. Okay, so that's for wind. So what you're going to see are 4 slides, 4 different areas for technologies showing costs over time, the blue bars, and green, the deployment. And the basic message in all cases is going to be dramatic cost reduction, dramatic deployment increases. This is wind. Just since 2008, wind capacity has nearly tripled and was the fastest growing source of capacity last year. 44% of new generating capacity in 2012 was wind. And as you can see, again, going back some time, dramatic reductions to where one is talking about levelized costs of about 6 cents per kilowatt hour. Photovoltaics, PV modules. Again, dramatic reduction. This is only since 2008. Deployment has increased by a factor of 10, and PV modules, they cost about 1% of what they did 35 years ago. But more important, and we can argue whether this is a true cost or this is Chinese costs or whatever, but the fact is PV modules available for about 80 cents a watt. And a reminder, the long-standing holy grail it has been about 50 cents a watt. I mean, this is tremendous progress. In fact, now it's the soft costs that we have to work on more to get those down. And again, you see the cost and deployment. I'll pause here just to say that a harbinger of what is coming is when energy incumbents start to seriously re-examine their business models in the face of what's happening. So many of you have seen today, for example, there are some, shall we call them, discussions going on between the solar industry and utilities, for example, in terms of how are distributed PV systems paid for electricity back to the grid, how are things like distribution system costs shared, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you know, it was only a few years ago when nobody cared. But the message is, in all of these, and I have 2 more to go through, you know, the future may not be always 10 years away, as I believe a lot of these technologies are beginning to establish their positions, and certainly with policy actions on climate front will only be helped further. Another example, LED lights. Last 5 years, again, cost of super efficient LEDs fallen more than 85%, and sales, it's a big surprise, are taking off. Today we're up to about 20 million fixtures. And there are many attractions for the LED. Of course, the problem is, let's say for your 60-watt incandescent light bulb equivalent, we're talking now about $20 for that fixture, 25,000 years of life, 25 times that of the incandescent bulb. So other than having this upfront capital cost, the economics are clear, especially with using only 20% of the power. In fact, the estimate is the lifetime savings of that one 60-watt incandescent bulb replaced by the equivalent LED over its 25,000-hour lifetime are well north of $100, one bulb. But you got to make the $20 upfront investment. But this is coming. And in fact, I'll as an aside, I'll say this does not even count the hidden costs of what you may need to do to replace the bulb 25 times. Particularly if you have a hotel, let's say, lights way up. You have the maintenance person, the ladders, et cetera, coming in. The OSHA violations, who knows? So anyway, you know, there are also hidden savings which can be very, very substantial. And finally, for electric vehicles and batteries, again, this shows a factor of 2 reduction in the batteries in just a relatively short time. That can go back to our Tesla discussion, where the costs are becoming much more affordable. But the real message is that if we come down another factor of 4, we're getting into the range where electric vehicles of significant range and much more mass appeal become possible. So, you know, and this deployment, the green curve, just to give you a reference point, I mean, we may be talking about 100,000 electric vehicles this year, much more than was predicted only a short time ago. This rate of increase in the early stages is substantially greater than that we saw for hybrid vehicles. These are inherently simpler vehicles, high performance, et cetera. So that's just a kind of a sampling of these kind of 4 different technology areas where I think there still is often a persistent idea that these are somehow decades away. Well, I think a lot of energy incumbents are beginning to think in a different way. I'm getting this. How am I doing on time? I probably should. Okay, I'm going to switch to then a last topic, and that's going back now to how I started when I discussed Sandy and climate preparedness. Again, the President's Climate Action Plan basically reflected a major, I would call, step change in recognizing adaptation as one of the highest policy goals, while favoring mitigation, but recognizing that we cannot turn away from adaptation. We are now bringing a suite of technologies and policies to meet this challenge. This morning, I was in New Jersey, in Sea Caucus, signing an MOU with Governor Christie and the New Jersey Transit Corporation. What this is I think, a perfect model of rebuilding in ways that are going to be resilient to the future. The project, which will be designed by our Sandia National Laboratory. In fact, I should say Sandia has already designed 25 microgrids for military installations, but now this will be adapting their tools to a civilian environment, a critical infrastructure environment, basically the transit in the northeast corridor between Trenton and Newark, and at a much bigger scale. We're talking about distributed generation assets within the microgrid clearly exceeding 50 megawatts. And the idea is, again, that this will take a key part of the infrastructure, including, by the way, for Manhattan. That is an important evacuation corridor for Manhattan if there's a major problem. It will address resilience. It will address economic benefits by providing what is in effect a smart grid. So this is the way that we are also, and the President put forward for us to be thinking about this resilience. It's not just about building seawalls, as important as that may be, or about elevating structures close to the sea, but it's also about building smart as we readdress the infrastructure and use this as perhaps an opportunity to develop the 21st century infrastructure. In fact, I should say here in New York, my understanding is the sea level in New York Harbor is about a foot higher than it was a century ago, and so we begin to understand the sensitivity to all of these climate actions, and we applaud New York for a number of the steps it's taken, including, by the way, establishing a green bank for efficiency and clean energy technologies. I would just add that we are also going to focus at DOE in these coming years on much more work with the states, because we believe this is a critical area for testing things out, for drawing upon the creativity that states and cities have been showing in terms of energy and climate policy. So. Finally, I'll just add that when it comes to emergency response and this adaptation part of the agenda, the Department of Energy, speaking now for our own responsibilities, is head of what's called Emergency Support Function 12 under the umbrella of FEMA, basically as the lead department for addressing energy infrastructure issues. We already operate the Northeast Heating Oil Reserve. We operate the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. On our nuclear weapons activity that David alluded to, we've had long-standing operational emergency response for nuclear incidents, for controlling nuclear weapons materials globally. But this is a new step out for us in terms of a major operational requirement in the civilian sector, if you like, working with all of our energy companies. And partly to do this, we have the Department of Energy had a reorganization looking at how our undersecretaries are deployed, basically assigning one of our 3 undersecretaries to focus on management and performance. So all of these operational questions, we are looking to upgrade our focus on that. I should add that in terms of the grid and resilience, of course, extreme weather is one issue, but in addition, things like cybersecurity are an increasing threat, one to which we are also devoting much more attention. I think given the time, I'm going to pretty much end there. I'd be happy to take questions on the quadrennial energy review, for example. But I think the message is, I hope, clear. One, our program in energy, the Department of Energy, is clearly directed by the President's Climate Action Plan. That is our focus. To do so, we will upgrade our efficiency work. We will continue to help drive down the costs of low carbon alternatives across the board, all the above, as we support also the work of other agencies like the EPA in addressing climate. But at the same time, as the President said, we have to acknowledge that we are seeing and will see more, frankly, of the impacts of climate. And so we must also look at how we develop our energy infrastructure for that future, an infrastructure that serves our economic goals, but also provides robustness and resilience against extreme weather events. And with that, I thank you for your attention and be happy to take some questions.
So we have about just under about 20 to 25 minutes for questions with the Secretary. We've been collecting them with cards. About half of them were related to hydraulic fracturing and fugitive methane. This is New York. And so if you want to start with that one, let's start with that one. There's a lot of concern here around the country, also here in New York, about shale gas development. What's your view of the role that natural gas plays in a low-carbon economy, how shale gas can be developed safely, particularly the issue of fugitive methane, and what actions the U.S. government is taking to help get there?
Okay, so first of all, it is a fact that in these last years, the natural gas revolution, shall we say, has been a major contributor to reducing carbon emissions. The president has a goal, as I mentioned, of 17% by 2020. We are about halfway there, and about half of that is because of the substitution of natural gas for coal in the power sector, essentially driven by market forces. In my previous life at MIT, when we did a study on natural gas, if you ask the question up front, is natural gas part of the problem or part of the solution for climate change, we reach the conclusion, yes. That is certainly in the near term and potentially for some years out, this substitution of natural gas for coal combustion without carbon capture would be a major contributor to reducing carbon emissions. But in the longer term, assuming we are cranking down hard on carbon emissions, then eventually gas itself would have to have carbon capture, or it would be too carbon intensive. So it's really, that is the classic definition of the bridge to the future, and we need to work on those technologies. Now, next question is, there's been a lot of controversy around methane emissions. And first of all, again, in the President's Climate Action Plan, there was specifically a call out for addressing what you might call the non-CO2 greenhouse gases, hydrofluorocarbons, for example, where we are working. In fact, we had an agreement with China to work on that. And then methane. And on methane, we currently have an interagency group formed at the President's direction, headed by the EPA, including Department of Energy, Department of Interior, and Department of Agriculture, for example, to look at methane emissions. We are in very close contact with the Environmental Defense Fund, who, of course, has had a major study of their own on methane emissions. So we will see what comes out of that.
Okay, we're gonna remove people from the room if they just shout out. Okay.
What about Bob Howard?
Okay.
The data currently look as though they are more on the low side of the estimates of methane emissions.
Not 9%
We will.
NOAA study.
Would you please let the Secretary answer your question?
He's talking about something else than
Okay.
what I'm talking about. The NOAA study
We're-
in Bob Howard. It says it's worse than coal.
We're gonna.
How can you substitute something?
The question has already been asked, and the Secretary's answering it. So let him answer the question. Okay.
I'll just wait for the answer then.
The current data suggests that is an incorrect statement, but we will be exploring it. And secondly, we will expand the study from the narrow focus around emissions at the well to emissions end-to-end, including in the transportation infrastructure. The other thing is, in addition, in terms of methane production at the well, of course, there are technologies that are increasingly being used to capture the methane. And in fact, as an aside, I mean, those can also be used beneficially in the environmental context in the sense that, for example, it's a lot better to use natural gas engines to drive the fracking fluid than it is to use diesel engines with local air quality issues. So that's a second point. And there was a third point. I'm trying to remember what it was now. What did I do? I did that. I did methane.
Anything over 2.3% means that it's worse than coal.
I mean, we could.
I've forgotten the third point. Anyway, that's where we are. And again, there's no issue in terms of CO2 emissions, at least that natural gas has. Oh, I know what the third one was. And then comes the issues of the safety in terms of fracking itself. And there, again, each of the issues to be addressed, I would argue, has clear solutions, but the technologies, the issues being manageable, I've always said, is not the same as being managed. We have to have consistent application of best standards through regulatory and other approaches. So I think that's the overall program, and that's what we're doing.
So let me just broaden the question, because there are questions about natural gas and fracking, a lot of them on these cards, and fugitive methane. There are also some more broadly about fossil fuels, about the all-of-the-above strategy. And the questions are sort of along the lines of why all of the above? Why not just focus on renewables? Why promote increased fossil fuel production? So you spoke passionately about the need to tackle with increased urgency the climate change problem. The administration has also welcomed the dramatic increase in oil and gas through new unconventional technologies here in this country. I think some people view those things as having some tension between them or being hard to reconcile. And so perhaps you could talk a little bit about how you think the public should understand how those things fit together, how they're consistent, what's the right way to think about being serious about climate and about the fact that the U.S. has the potential to significantly increase its oil and gas production.
Certainly. First of all, let's start with, again, the ground truth. 80% of our energy today is fossil derived. The transportation sector is still today, within within 10%, 10% ethanol, but largely is dependent upon oil as the transportation fuel. Now, I talked here about hopefully going to a future where we see a lot more electric vehicles using low-carbon electricity going forward. But the reality is, in the energy business, it's extremely hard to see very, very rapid changes in the deployment. So we have to, our view is we have to be practical, pragmatic, totally committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, doing so and accelerating that to the extent that we can within the current realities. Now, let me go to your specific questions about gas and oil. First of all, I would say they're a bit different questions. On the oil side, our production has gone up substantially. In fact, in the last 5 years, the added capacity in global oil production, the United States has been by far the biggest contributor to that. In fact, bigger than the next three combined. And that's come mainly from the unconventional tight oil. Now here, what we're seeing here is a substitution for imports. This has significant economic benefits. It's not changing the carbon balance specifically, but it is certainly reducing our balance of payments substantially. It wasn't long ago we were spending $1 billion a day on imported oil. That's now at its lowest level in many, many years, and our production is the highest level in many, many years. But in the spirit of what I said, how I defined all of the above, but we are working assiduously in multiple dimensions to reduce oil dependence. The president pushed unprecedented CAFE standards, a doubling of fuel efficiency by 2025, and that's already having an effect. We are working on next generation biofuels, and we are working on, as one saw, especially the battery technology that is key to electric vehicle penetration. But beyond that, other things for lightweighting vehicles, et cetera, new materials, which, by the way, was part of the Tesla safety success as well, I might add. So we are producing more oil, we are reducing imports, and we are working to reduce oil dependence at the same time. On natural gas, it's a little bit different. In fact, maybe I should have said, if you look at the cost of removing the marginal ton of CO2, it's in broad terms, it's probably lowest for efficiency, it's next for electricity, and it's highest for transportation. So that's the one that's going to be a little bit harder, frankly, in terms of getting this transition. Now, natural gas serves three major sectors of the United States, almost equally: heating, electricity, and industrial applications. On electricity is where we are seeing the large growth because of the low prices, and again, this has been beneficial for our carbon equation. It's why we are the lead industrialized economy that is actually reducing carbon emissions. But going forward, again, we're not just sitting on this. We are pushing solar hard, wind. We are just now going to go into our first support for offshore wind, for example, a place where cost reduction is required. Nuclear, provisional loan guarantee to see if new nuclear power plants built in the United States come in on budget and are reasonable, even as gas takes a more prominent place in the mix. So that's our philosophy. Philosophy is we've got to keep pushing on carbon, we have to be pragmatic, and we have to keep working on those alternatives that will support a very low carbon economy in the future.
I'm going to take the questions roughly in the order of preponderance, so they sort of stack up. So that shale gas development and fugitive methane was sort of the largest stack.
Was 2 kilograms worth?
The next largest is on the export of natural gas. I suspect you may not be very specific in answering this question, but the question's along the lines of how much and by when and how many days till the next permit. And so assuming you may not answer that question, maybe more broadly, the two recent orders, Freeport and Lake Charles approving natural gas, were quite forceful in explaining why the department thought approving exports of natural gas were in the public interest. They talked about the need to look at cumulative impacts and changing market conditions. I don't know if, hypothetically speaking, you can talk about the kinds of things you'll be monitoring and looking at. What sort of scenario in the future might lead one to a different conclusion about whether this is in the public interest?
It's an excellent question. Next.
Okay.
No. So I think first of all, for the audience who may not be quite as familiar, so the Department of Energy is called upon to license applications for the export of natural gas to non-free trade agreement countries. For countries with a free trade agreement, it's essentially automatic unless there was some glaring issue to make it not in the public interest. That's sort of like Mexico in the sense of NAFTA, for example. South Korea is a gas user and a free trade agreement country. But most of the market for natural gas are countries that do not have free trade agreements with the United States. That includes Europe, includes Japan, includes India. So we have to judge on those. So as Jason implied, the department has issued 3 licenses. One of them is final, and I should caution, just note, I mean, as a statement of fact, that the last 2 that were just issued in the last few months are provisional licenses. They still need to go through the NEPA process, for example, which is run out of FERC. So environmental review is still needed to come back for a final license. In the first case, license granted, I think that was about a year in between the provisional and the final license. And even then, that project is still not exporting. It's still, I think, a couple of years away from exports, because these are large capital investments. $billion scale, and one has to arrange customers and suppliers to make the project go. So going forward, what we have said is, this was established certainly before I was secretary, that we evaluate the applications case by case, roughly speaking, in the order submitted. There's a published order, so everybody knows where they are in the queue, and we are working through the next one. There's no secret. The next one is Cove Point. You can go on our website, and in Maryland, the only one on the East Coast, and we're now evaluating that application. As you say, it's a public interest criterion, so environmental issues clearly come in. As I said, that's the second stage. Impact on the economy, the market conditions are an issue, so we will monitor that. And as you say, it is published that the department will be looking at market conditions in the context of cumulative commitments to export. So those are the ground rules. Just kind of repeated what you've said, but I will note an obvious issue, that granting a license isn't the same as having the gas exported, and so that's going to be something that we're going to have to face at some point down the road in terms of how we evaluate those probabilities together in terms of what it might do with market impact.
We have about 10 more minutes, so I'm going to move quickly through as many of these as I can. There were several questions here about nuclear energy. You know a little bit about that. What do you think should be done to handle the Indian Point nuclear plant? And then more broadly, what's stopping us from establishing more sources of nuclear power?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the Indian Point plant specifically. I mean, first of all, I must say I probably don't know enough about the specifics of the Indian Point plant. But if I take the bigger picture, there are several issues. One is, as I already alluded to, the department did issue a provisional $8 billion loan guarantee for the construction of the first two new nuclear power plants in Georgia. There are two additional ones in South Carolina. So there are four next half generation, I would say, nuclear plants being built. They have some new safety features, et cetera. I think the big question with those plants is going to be, do they get built on budget and, more or less on budget and schedule? If they do, then I think there will probably be a relook in some places for new nuclear power plants. If they have very bad budget performance, as did some recently in Europe, I think it will seriously cloud any future for such gigawatt scale plants. I don't want to imply there's an issue now. The latest reports from both Georgia and South Carolina are encouraging, but they're still in the early stages of the projects. Second issue, of course, is post-Fukushima. And there are clearly a number of steps the NRC will be taking for licensees and licensees. They clearly there will be probably some increase in operating costs in responding to new regulations. For example, maybe a requirement for periodic seismic review as opposed to just a one-time seismic review. Various other issues, how spent fuel is stored. We still don't know the full extent of what will be required, but that will do some, at least marginal increase of operating costs, which can have an impact. But the third thing, the third and fourth things. The third thing I would say is clearly the nuclear waste back end remains an issue. I was a member of the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future prior to my becoming secretary. And I and the administration position and the proposed Senate bill are all aligned that we think the Blue Ribbon Commission core recommendations need to be followed. And those two are principally a consent-based process for nuclear storage facilities, and B, a dual track of consolidated dry cask storage, presumably under federal control, which eliminates our liability that we are paying in utilities, and secondly, the geological disposal track. The fourth nuclear point I would make is that there is some promise, I emphasize it's only promise at this stage, about kind of a new generation of reactors called small modular reactors. So these would be much smaller units, maybe 200 megawatts, maybe even smaller. If these are economical, they generally have very attractive safety features, and they could be an important part of a nuclear future. But we won't know until we build some. The Department of Energy has provided some assistance to move one, and soon a second and possibly a third to licensing. And the target date would be a first modular reactor operating in 2022.
Great. There are a couple of questions about foreign policy and international energy, particularly about what the change in the North American energy landscape means for America's place in the world. One of the questions says, in the past, the U.S. has conducted a kind of defensive energy policy, blocking and tackling with countries like Russia, protecting interests in the Mideast. But given the revolution in shale oil and gas, there's an opportunity now to be more proactive and offensive. Can you talk a little bit about what you see as the geostrategic implications of the changing energy picture in the U.S., what the department's international priorities are? You've announced a reorganization. How the work will be managed moving forward, international energy policy will be managed?
Well, first of all, in terms of the current situation with regard to the increasing gas and oil, first of all, the substantial increase in natural gas production in the United States has already had, I would say, kind of a geopolitical consequence, even though we haven't exported anything. Basically because all the LNG that was supposed to be imported went elsewhere, like to Europe, for example. Now, in the future, and I would say here, I would go beyond the United States, and it's a big unknown, how much and when. But certainly if the world's unconventional gas resources are developed aggressively, nominally resource in place in China is bigger than the United States for shale. Argentina has got some very attractive looking reservoirs. Eastern Europe. Now, a lot of this was very enthusiastic a few years ago. A few below ground realities and above ground realities have taken a little bit of the bloom off the rose in some places. But again, there is a potential for dramatically shifting the flows of natural gas globally, and that'll play out over the next decade, I would say. With regard to oil, I think the United States becoming a much more significant producer is certainly plays in here. But I do remind you, I think sometimes, especially on the oil side, the assumptions about big geopolitical shifts, just because of that, tend to be perhaps overplayed. I would note, for example, that we get very little of our imported oil from the Middle East. It doesn't change our security posture in that part of the world. I mean, that's just a fact, right? And there are many reasons. One is we have many more security equities than just oil. But secondly, the United States has unique national security and foreign policy responsibilities in the global order. And to the extent to which our key allies are subject to strong energy security problems, and that inevitably influences our freedom of action in national security and foreign affairs. So I think it's a much more complicated story, but bottom line, if unconventional resources are developed strongly around the world over the next decade, there is no doubt global markets will change, shifts will be different, infrastructure requirements will be different, and we'll see how that plays out.
Let me quickly throw one last one in. There are several questions here about how the administration thinks about incorporating renewables into the U.S. grid, the outlook for grid-tied energy storage applications. Can you talk a little bit about the steps that the department's taking to make the grid capable of taking more renewables, along with the policies to drive that?
Several things. First of all, we are looking hard at, in fact, we're right now, again, refreshing a roadmap in terms of utility-scale storage technologies, which obviously could have an enormous impact. Right now, in terms of the grid itself, a number of things, a number of activities. I'll mention one, for example, mainly using recovery funds. The department has supported the deployment of a substantial number of what are called phasers in the transmission grid. So essentially making detailed phase measurements. And this is seeing issues there. I mean, well, collecting the data, of course, and analyzing the data can be a way of getting a very, very strong signal about impending problems and giving one the opportunity to address them. So that's just one example of a lot of what I would call smart technology that we are trying to help to deploy. Actually, an example I already mentioned in my remarks was this morning's event with Governor Christie in terms of actually trying to move towards building a physical microgrid of non-trivial scale there. It will, by the way, include, assuming the project goes forward to full construction, it will include a lot of integration of renewables in that microgrid as well. Now, I think there's a much bigger story in terms of especially remote, large-scale renewables, wind and solar, and there it's a big infrastructure issue. There, I will just advertise the last part of the talk that I did not give. We are starting again. It's in the President's Climate Action Plan, something called the Quadrennial Energy Review. The Department of Energy will be the executive secretariat for an effort that will span the entire administration. Its focus will be on infrastructure. How do we evolve a 21st century infrastructure, electricity, gas, you name it, and one that is integrated, that has got resilience to natural events, cyber secure, and can integrate large-scale renewables and large-scale distributed generation into the transmission and distribution systems.
Great. We're out of time. You said that there was a part of the talk that you didn't give, and there are enough cards here to be able to talk for another hour. So hopefully you'll come back and spend more time with us again. And as you can see, there's a lot of interest, a lot of passion on these issues, and we appreciate your taking some time to talk with us today about the truly important issues that are at stake for the U.S. energy outlook. I want everyone to please join me in thanking the Energy Secretary for being here today. As I said, we have many more events coming up this fall. Follow us at energypolicy.columbia.edu. Follow us on Twitter at Columbia U Energy. Please remain seated until the Energy Secretary has left the room for about 20 more seconds, and then we can all exit together. Thank you again for coming today.